Good morning. It's an honor to be here with you this morning. At the personal level, I feel like it's connecting two ends. Canada, my adopted country, and Singapore that seems to have adopted me. And so it's meaningful to me to present to you today some of the work we've been doing. We have in recent years built a number of projects in Southeast Asia, Marina Bay Sands, Jewel at Changi Airport, which I hope many of you will have a chance to see before you leave, Raffles City in Chongqing, China. These projects focus on the public realm, trying to rethink how to bring vitality into the public realm in the city. I will not speak about that today. I will speak specifically about our efforts in the realm of housing, which is perhaps one of the most urgent, unresolved issues, both for society and certainly for my profession, architects. I would like to begin by going back. Are we getting the slides? Okay. So I'd like to go back actually 63 years when I was a student at McGill University, and the Canadian government introduced a new traveling scholarship program. One student from each school of architecture in Canada would travel through North America to study housing. In 1959, we embarked on a journey that, to me, was life-changing. And it would help if the images could tell you why it was life-changing. And so as we traveled, we recognized that in urban housing, there was the dominance of the high-rise buildings, mostly for low-income families in the cities. This is Chicago. We saw the same in New York, in Montreal, in Toronto to a certain extent, and all over. People being housed in high-rise buildings, mostly poor families. Luxury housing was quite rare, urban luxury housing and high-rise at the time. And alternatively, for those who had the choice, suburbia, Levittowns, surrounding every North American cities, the middle class, the emerging middle class, living in single-family houses with all the waste of land and energy that we are now so conscious of, and commuting and traveling and so on. And I came back from that trip with a kind of conclusion that suburbia was not a long-term solution to urban housing, but people preferred living in houses to apartments, and the apartments did not respond to quality of life that the house gave you. So my conclusion was, as an innocent student, we got to reinvent the apartment building. And I set out for my thesis at McGill to develop a new housing idea. I called it a three-dimensional housing system. The idea was to modularize housing into prefabricated three-dimensional components and to stack them, this is my McGill thesis, to stack them in such a way that each house has a garden, is open in all directions, is served by a system of open streets rather than corridors. And I thought that in that case, everybody would prefer to live in the city and we will live happily ever after. Then, a few years later, 1963, a new opportunity opened up. Expo was coming to Montreal, and I was asked to head the team that designed the master plan for the Expo, and I said I'd come back and work on it on condition that I could develop my thesis further as a proposal for the World's Fair. And this took a lot of nerve, I guess, chutzpah, I would call it. and I was given the resources to develop this in parallel. And we developed a scheme which consisted of a whole community on the Cité du Havre site of Expo, which, it's keeping my pace, which included a hillside of houses with gardens, with schools, a whole kind of community at the lower levels under these sort of hillsides are all the community facilities. This is kind of the beginning of the mixed-use integrated city. This went to the cabinet for I presented it to the federal cabinet, and the idea was it would be built by the private sector through a tax break. The cabinet decided the tax break was too much of a precedent. They said, we can't do it, there's not enough time, but take here $17 million, do what you can. And as a young man, I was first very disappointed, but got back to my senses, and out of that came Habitat 67, as you know it, which was one of the attractions of Expo. Now, what we achieved there is demonstrated, the capacity to, next please. There is Habitat, as many of you know. It was built in a factory that we built next door. We pre-finished the units on the ground, and the dwellings are truly house-like. Now, 60 years later, we know that as a desirable place to live in, there's no dispute. The people who live in Habitat feel it fulfills the kind of quality of life that they aspire to. And now we have second, third generation living in the complex. But the question was, is it repeatable? Is it repeatable in the marketplace? Let me just run through. You can see here the units being raised into position. This was a wonderful collaboration of private-public sector. Prefabricated bathrooms made out of plastic, whole single units. And this is 60 years ago. And here you see the complex as it is today. The government of Quebec declared it a heritage building some years ago, which now protects the building and helps maintain it. And certainly there is a very powerful sense of community of the residents of Habitat that demonstrates it's also a very living community apart from the quality of life that it offers. In the 1970s, there were many commissions for habitats that we received. New York Habitat, Puerto Rico, Washington for the housing HUD in the United States, Israel for the Ministry of Housing, none of which were realized. They were not realized because industry, and I think the economy, and the whole system of construction were just too resistant. What we could do in a world sphere, we could not do in the open marketplace. And many of the critics said, this is an interesting idea, but it is not reproducible, which at the time almost appeared to be the case. But fast forward, I come like 25 years later, one of the things we realize is that even in our worst dreams in 1967, we did not think that cities would be built in the densities and the concentration that they actually were. Here you have images of Hong Kong and images of Singapore. The densities we build today, the mixed-use projects that we build today, are of entities we did not imagine. And so in 2009, we decided in our office to set up a research fellowship and say, okay, things have gone by. Maybe the construction industry has changed, although I regret to tell you right up front it hasn't changed much. But densities have increased. How would we address the ideas of habitat today? And over a period of a year, we developed some 30 different studies. You see here some of the models. These are all going to be at McGill soon. I'll come back to that later. And we developed a whole series of systems I'll just highlight a couple of them. One was to take habitat and simplify it. Simplify it in terms of construction. Next, please. All vertical structure, panelized rather than in boxes, direct plumbing lines, and actually we demonstrated that we can achieve a much greater economy, the kind of housing amenities comparable to habitat. We also took the case of New York and said, let's take the midtown density and create a mixed-use projects of offices and housing and retail at the same mix, but rethought of, reorganized. And the density of New York is approximately an FAR of 12, floor coverage of 12. And again, this led us to this scheme where the first 25 floors are offices. There's a pedestrian street, the beginning of the Sky Park idea that connects the buildings on top, and above for the next 50 floors are residential developments with gardens, public gardens, private gardens, very much like habitat. This is a density of Midtown New York. And we thought that was very exciting as a concept. And lo and behold, as research often proves, this started trickling into our practice, particularly in Southeast Asia. And so in the last few years, some of these ideas have been realized. This is a complex, completed, part of it completed 5 years ago, part of it now being completed. We're doing this with Kerry Construction of Hong Kong, thousands of units in Qinghuandao, not far from Beijing on the coast. It is middle-income housing. There are multiple terraces and public gardens, and in terms of the quality of life, very much like habitat, not all of what habitat offered, but much of it, and it's conventionally built. It is not industrialized in the sense that habitat was, but you see the terraces and the gardens and the amenities that are available, really nature brought into the complex. What pleases us is this is within the marketplace, without subsidy, middle-income housing. Not far from here, at the outskirts of Bishan in Singapore, we built Sky Habitat with Capital Land. Again, middle-income housing. This is not downtown luxury housing. And the emphasis here is this is a community. We created 3 levels of bridges with playgrounds, swimming pools, community facilities. Many of the units have terraces. All of them have balconies. 600 families live here. It's a very high density. You see here the bridges and the public areas. It is surrounded by HDB developments around it. And these days, if you want to know if your project succeeded, you just got to go to the internet, TikTok, Instagram, and you can see the life in our project. So you see here the residents praising and raving about how happy they are living there. So this a demonstration. Even on a very tight site in Quito, in Ecuador, we demonstrate that we can achieve modular, not 3-dimensional modules, but industrialized construction with garden apartments, even though it's a small site, as you see here. Next, please. That's the project in Quito. Coming full circle, this is one of the apartments in Habitat on the 10th and 11th level. It's the apartment that I lived in for many, many years. And once the Quebec government designated the project, I restored my apartment back to exactly the way it was in 1967, because it is in itself also part of the heritage definition. And this apartment has now been gifted as part of my archive to McGill University. So it'll be open for visitors to see how life was in Habitat, and there'll be exhibits there and meetings there that will advance the concept of housing research. Remember the project I showed you that the government said too expensive? Epic Games have now decided to take this project. We've given them all the drawings, they've digitized them, and they've decided to create a virtual reality complex of the original habitat design that was never realized. In 3 months, it'll be announced to the public. It'll be public domain. Anybody could go in there with the goggles and without, go for a walk, buy an apartment, imagine how it is to live there. This is just a little snippet that they let me show you as a preview, so let's run it, please. So you can see that how, in spite of the density, how airy it is, the sort of inclined planes with housing development. Otis had developed an inclined elevator, so we could serve the residents with these inclined A-frames. In the lower levels were schools, offices, community facilities, even agricultural garden patches. The entire complex, as habitat was totally prefabricated. So it seems to me, looking back, that even though that's a 60-year-old concept, it's as relevant today, and I hope that the ability of people to wander about and go for a walk and enter an apartment and imagine living there will bring this project into realization in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your journey as an architect all over the world with your project. I would like now to introduce l'Honorable Jean Charest, Honorary Chairman, Canada-ASEAN Business Council, Associé chez McCarthy-Tétrault, former Premier of Quebec, member of the Queen's Privy Council for Canada. So without further ado, let's start an amazing conversation led by Mr. Charest.
Thank you very much, Caroline. So you can hear me well, because I can hear myself very well. And I'm going to go home tonight, and I am going to brag for the rest of my life that Moshe Safdie poured me a glass of water. And you've just given us a present. I hope you realize you've given us a presentation. You have given us the kind of presentation where people are going to go back home today, and if they're asked, what about this conference and what you remember, your name is going to come up. And what you've just shared with us is, how old were you in 1967?
5.
Pardon me?
I was 22 when I returned. I had gone to work for Lucan after graduation, and when I was invited back, Claude Robillard and Sandy Van Ginkel to head the team, I was 22. I was 23 when it was first designed and 29 when Expo opened.
Well, it is. You know, Stephen Toop said something interesting in the presentation that preceded ours about AI, and he talked about a signature. And you embody a Canadian signature in your life's work and what you've created and what you've done. And you very recently, and I guess we should thank you, there's 2 things I think the audience may or may not know. You have just decided, after a lot of competition, to gift to McGill University, where you studied, your archives, including les maquettes and all the, and there was stiff competition from other universities who wanted that. So we should thank you for that, because it's going to stay in there. And we appreciate that. The other part is that you now represent Canada's signature throughout the world. And you've done the Marina Bay Sands project here, the airport, and other projects. And you very recently also, and we should thank you for that, wrote your memoirs. Because those of us who listen to you today in the room, you've left us with a sense that we want to learn more. And the title of the memoirs is If Walls Could Speak, My Life in Architecture. Tell us a bit about what you wanted to capture in the memoirs. You've talked about what is it that what are the main ideas you want to pass on?
I'll answer that question, but I want to say one thing before in response to what you said about Canada. I think it's important to reflect that, I was a young, new immigrant, never built a building, civil servant, working for civil servants. The head of Expo Construction was from the military. There were civil servants who were trying to create something extraordinary, and the trust and confidence they put in a young person at the time shows how open Canada was and how receptive it was to both new ideas, young people, how bold these decisions were. I think they were the brave ones who actually should get the credit. To answer your question on the memoir, it's been brewing in me because, after 50 years, or more than that even, in architecture, I realize how confused the public, lay people, interested, educated lay people, about what architecture is, what is a good building. I mean, people say, oh, it's such a beautiful building, but it doesn't work at all. That's not possible. Beautiful buildings have to work, otherwise there's something faulty in the conception.
Yeah.
And therefore the idea that beautiful but not functional doesn't exist for me. To be really beautiful, it has to resonate with the life intended in the building. And so I realize that people have a hard time assessing. I mean, often we're interviewed, and I realize people interview architects, but they don't go and visit their buildings. Why interview them? The way they smile? Go look at their building. So I thought by sharing my life as an architect professionally, this is not about my love life. It's about my life it is about my love life with architecture. But it is about the process of building that I felt people reading it will understand and feel about architecture in a way maybe beyond what they do today. And then came COVID and gave me the opportunity. So there it is.
So ladies and gentlemen, the title of this book is If Walls Could Speak, My Life in Architecture. And you just launched it in Canada, I understand?
Yes, it's just been published.
So we will be buying the book, I assure you. And I wanted to ask you, so you have left this signature, and you gave an interview very recently to a radio show called The Current, and in 2022. I listened to it twice because I thought it was very compelling. And there's a few things you say in that. And frankly, the challenge in interviewing you is that there is so much ground to cover. But you do refer to, in architecture, the distinction between functionality and purpose. And that seemed to be something that was very important for you in what you do. Could you tell us what is this distinction that you are, that it inhabits you, I guess, when you do a project?
It's a fundamental and wonderful question because functionality, as it's come to be understood in the language, I'm not sure it is its dictionary meaning, but when you say functionality, you think utility. Does it work? Like functionality is a plumbing working? Is it maintainable? If you say it's going to uplift your spirit and you think about God, nobody thinks of that as functionality. So I thought, because the word has been in some way debased, we need to introduce a word that's much more comprehensive, and that's why I said form and purpose, not form and function, but form and purpose. Because if you think of a school, the purpose of a school is to be a wonderful place for learning, number one. The plumbing should work, but a wonderful place for learning, where students interact, where they feel good about the space, where there's this spontaneous interaction with the students, that there's indoor and outdoor, that you feel nature. So purpose is much more expansive and comprehensive, and that is a way to evaluate a work of architecture. Not just in this sort of minimalist way of its functioning. And that leads me to the notion of beauty, because I feel that if we look at nature and think of nature, we think of beautiful things that that we comprehend as we see in nature how, in a Darwinian sense, there's fitness to purpose. We look at the wonder of how bees create community, how flowers attract, the whole sense of nature. And so to me, design of nature, in the Darcy Thompson created the science of morphology, the design of nature is the best lesson for a teacher for an architect.
And nature is a common theme of your work, and this connection. You keep returning to the connection to nature, and I think you even have a theme about it, a garden.
For everyone a garden.
For everyone a garden. And it's interesting because, of course, climate change is a big issue now, and biodiversity and protection of biodiversity. And it'll be a big issue here in this part of the world, and Canada feels we have a connection in helping and cooperating with Asia on how we can all deal with the issues of climate. But you, very early on in your career, I mean, Habitat was about that connection
yes.
to nature. So what is it that made you come to this idea of nature? Was it your initial tour of these houses that you saw? Or?
I think actually that goes even further to my childhood in Haifa, in what was then Palestine and then Israel, which I lived close to the Baha'i gardens in Haifa. Baha'i gardens are exquisite Persian gardens, which is the holiest place for the Baha'i religion, where the founder. And this notion of the paradise garden I found very compelling. In fact, I used to think of it as like a little model of what paradise was as described in the scriptures. But as I developed as an architect, I realized that we as a species are programmed to enjoy being in nature. When we're with trees and with green and when we are by the sea, we have a sense of well-being. And modern cities, with all the density and congestion, deprive us of that. And to me, the key to resolving urban life in the future is to bring nature into the city. I mean, the reason I'm excited about Jewel at Changi Airport is it shows you can create a great big shopping bazaar-like place, but you're in nature. You're surrounded by plant life, and you can do that. It's just a little demonstration of what could be not even at a larger scale.
And it's quite fascinating because people actually make the trip to visit the airport as a sortie. I want to now bring you to something very practical and political, actually. And there is in Canada a very, very high level of anxiety about affordability of housing. In fact, in our country, the residential housing market weighs for a great part of our gross domestic product, more than average countries, and it weighs on our economy. But now there is this sense that the next generation of young Canadians will not be able to buy a house. Toronto, Vancouver. Now it's very acute in Canada, but as you know, it's true elsewhere in the world. It's a world problem. How does your work, is that part of your thinking? It is part of your thinking.
Absolutely.
Do you see answers that we don't see in terms of density, regulations, what municipalities,
I think some of the answers can be found here in Singapore, but let me explain that. I think there are a number of components to what constitutes the cost of housing. One of them, of course, is the cost of money, cost of land, cost of construction. So these are all a mix. I found there were periods in which we worked very hard to lower construction costs. You lower it by 20%, land values go up by 50%, it erases the advantage. So what we're finding is, on one hand, take a city like Toronto, extraordinary density, I think extreme, too much. And it's driven by zoning and by letting developers build denser through zoning. And then the developer maximizes value by charging all he can. And much of that cost is in the land. There are many cases where the land cost is twice as much as construction cost. If you look at Singapore, if you go and try and buy land, at this point it's extreme. But Singapore solves it by taking public land, government-owned land, and designating some of it for housing through HDB, and every Singaporean can get housing through an actually fixed land price. You can call it subsidized, but it's just the pricing land so you can afford it. Now, many of our communities in Canada don't have that much public land in the hands of government. But unless we solve the land issue, I think we won't solve the housing problem, because that is what's currently driving urban housing, even the smallest apartment being so extremely expensive. And I think the other part is we got to radically change the construction industry. We're still building today, as we did 100 years ago, with, yes, there's BIM, and yes, there's industrialization, and you can get stuff made with new techniques, but fundamentally, it's concrete and it's steel, and everything is done on the site twice. Have you ever renovated a house or built a house?
Yes, and I'm still married.
Hmm? And didn't the contractor have to do everything twice because everything was once wrong? So just think about it in your own experiences. The construction industry is primitive, and we need to find a way to bring in the same efficiencies of other industries.
Does that mean more prefabrication out of site? And
it means prefabrication off-site for sure. It means standardization of certain modular systems that can be, I thought when we did Habitat that we do it like cars, all assembled in one place. But today cars are made in 10 different countries and assembled. So, but to do that, they've standardized the components so they can take one component from one place and put it together. Construction needs to achieve the same. We need a real breakthrough in building materials, because steel needs to be fireproofed and is not the most efficient enclosing material. Concrete is terrific, except that it cracks. It's not very good in tension, and it doesn't insulate. Now, every other industry has developed materials that they need. In other words, very light and strong and fireproof for aircraft industry, and so on. In building construction, we're stuck with the same materials for hundreds of years.
are there new materials you see out there?
We see them, but we can't afford them in construction yet. So I think we need a greater effort to make them affordable, sustainable, depends what materials you're making. Timber is a big source now. Cross-laminated timber, we're finding that we can build housing modules and go up to 8 stories with timber, maybe 12. Well, that's pretty good density.
And when I was
it's sustainable.
And sustainable.
And Canada has a lot of it.
And when I was in government, the industry, because they went through a rough period, kept pressing us on building codes that would encourage the use.
Yes.
Of. Do you agree with that? That's that we can do more with forestry products? And
yes.
Tell us. So you also, in your experience, because what comes through is that you obviously believe in public-private partnerships. You tell us a bit about that. In other words, as we look ahead to what we need to do, you see that partnership as being instrumental in getting things done. Am I right with that?
And I see it in my own work, but I see it generally in certain complexes. I mean, there's been periods. Well, first of all, I think a very fascinating example is how the COVID vaccine was developed. And I think that is a very interesting model for public-private partnership, that it was the work of industry and government taking some of the risks, and at the same time getting the best out of industry and keeping it competitive. An example in my own experience is Marina Bay Sands. Of course, it was built by the private sector, by Las Vegas Sands. It was financed by them. But it was really a partnership, because when the government decided to call for proposals for an integrated resort, it fixed the price of the land.
Okay.
And it set up a bidding system in which the merits of the project, by criteria that they defined, design, contribution to culture, contribution to tourism, there were criteria. The project that provides the most would get selected. So you get all the developers with a different state of mind. What can we do for Singapore in what they submit? Then the government cleverly sets up a control system so they can't back out after they got chosen. So that if I say, people say to me, how did you manage to build sky parks and such a radical project with a developer? Who generally, developer, not just that particular client, tend to be quite conservative and bottom line driven. The reason was the way it was set up, essentially as a private-public collaboration. And it's the kind of interaction between the URA, Urban Redevelopment Authority, Tourist Board, governmental agencies, and the developer towards the same objective, to create a very powerful attraction of tourism for the country and also a place for the community.
Our time is almost up, and I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, because all the Canadians who are here in this room and our country is challenged by the emergence of Asia and fascinated by it, and we want to be part of it. You have been here, you've been successful, you've carried the Canadian flag. Do you have any insights to share with us on what Canada should be doing in general in Asia? What is it that we're not doing now that maybe we should be doing more of, and how do we approach Asia writ large? By the way, we have a new Indo-Pacific strategy which covers a large geography. Do you have any thoughts on what it is that...
I think I should stick to my field. No. But in my field, I think that Canada at some point was cutting edge in urban thinking, and I think that more energy and effort should be put into the urban questions that face Canadian cities. And I think that will be exportable. I mean, in a sense, what I showed today was born in Canada and exported. Yeah. But I think more of that would be great. And I've recently been building in Toronto. And I have to say, I find it business as usual. The developers lead the day. The zoning follows the developers' objectives, and sort of the kind of bold ideas, of big ideas of urban planning are not as they should be. I mean, I think back, I once did the research on the origins of Mount Royal Park. As well, you're a part-time Montrealer.
Yeah.
How did that come to be? And when you read in the archives the opposition and all the objection, but it was a bold, big idea. Same thing with Central Park in New York. These ideas today just wouldn't have a chance. So we need to recalibrate our priorities in the environmental field.
And rethink. Now, in this interview you gave, and we're almost up with it, you said something that pleased me a great, great deal. And it referred to whether you were ever going to retire. And I found a lot of inspiration in your answer. And so you are you're obviously very healthy and in good form, and you're doing as much as you did when you were in your 20s. How do you see the future? And for yourself?
I'm just having a good time, and I don't see why I should stop.
Well, I think the people in this room agree and would hope that you would never stop. And you have made an extraordinary contribution to our country. And we get a sense of pride in every project that you do. We feel that we see a Canadian flag on the Marina Bay Sands. We see it in the public library in Vancouver, in the National Arts And so we're indebted to you. You've given us a signature in the world. And the book, by the way, is If Walls Could Speak, My Life in Architecture. Did I mention that? I think I did that. And I look forward to, like many in this room, reading it. So Moshe Safdie.
You'll get an autographed copy soon.
Thank you. So Moshe Safdie.
It's a pleasure, and
Thank you.
I followed you're my premier, so I followed your career, and it's an honor and pleasure to have the conversation together.
Well, thank you. On behalf of Canada, thank you. Yeah,